Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Striketh, and today we're going to take a look at the military quarter in Naxxramas. In the previous episodes, we took a look at the plague quarter and of course the arachnid quarter, and now we're going to do the same thing here. So without further ado, let's go ahead and just hop right in. So first up is Dancing Swords. This is a 3-cost 4/4, where the death rattle causes your opponent to draw a card. This is quite a severe drawback for any card really, but in this particular card, it's pretty bad. I mean, the stats on the card are good. You're like, wow, it's a 4/4 for 3, that's really great. And yes, it is, but only in certain decks. The decks you're going to want to use this card in are generally going to be cards or decks that don't care how many cards your opponent draws. For example, a mill deck or a aggro deck where you're just focused on killing your opponent as fast as you can. So those are the kind of decks that I would use this in. But of course, you have to keep in mind that you can silence this card to negate the effect. So that is also a possibility, because normally in a card game, you don't want your opponent to outdraw you, because they get further in their deck, they find more answers, and that allows them to win more often than not. So keep this in mind when playing this card. But overall, because of the death rattle and because it's pretty severe for the stats, I would probably give this card an average rating at best. It's got good stats on it, but it's not something that you'd want to play in every single deck because it's just has too much of a drawback. So moving on. The Death Lord. This is one of the cards that has received the most attention in Naxxramas. Everyone saw this and was like, whoa, it's a 2/8, it's a zoo killer. Well, yes, it's a 3-cost 2/8 with taunt, and the death rattle makes your opponent put one of their minions onto the battlefield. This can work for you or against you. For example, if they have a 1/1 in their deck and it puts that on the board when the Death Lord dies, that's perfectly fine. But if you're up against Zoo, for example, and when the Death Lord dies, it puts one of their Doom Guards for free onto the battlefield, well, that sucks for you. So it's a good card, but it has a pretty large drawback. And of course, if you silence the card to get rid of the death rattle, then it loses taunt, and it makes the card kind of useless, because that's, what it was designed for in the first place. So I like this card in priest decks because you can keep healing it up, and you can keep it alive, which kind of negates a lot of the drawback. If it doesn't die, then you don't have to worry about the card ever enforcing that death rattle. Of course, priests love this card too, because they can use the Cabal Shadow Priest to just steal it from you. And that's not great for you either. So it's a good card, but I feel like it's a little bit too susceptible to RNG right now, which kind of seems to be the way Blizzard is going with this new expansion. They're kind of embracing the random elements in the game more and more, it seems, to the point where you have these good cards, but the death rattles and such make them unreliable, so you never really know what's going to happen. It's kind of like Ragnaros, where Ragnaros hits a random target, so you might need him to hit face, but he'll hit that 0/2 taunt instead, and that's just the way the game works at this point in time. So Death Lord is potentially a good card, but it all depends on what his death rattle puts on your opponent's board when he dies, and he will die. Next up, Baron Ribbon-Dare. He's a 4-cost 1/7, and it causes minions to trigger their death rattle twice. As soon as this card was announced, every single person thought of Sylvanas. Sylvanas dies and triggers her death rattle twice, steal 2 minions from your opponent. That could be really powerful. The problem with this card is that it is, of course, only a 1/7, so it's susceptible to things like Kodo. It can be silenced, and if it's silenced, it's pretty much useless then, and so on and so forth. So it's an okay card, but you need to, in my opinion, play this card right when you're about to trigger a death rattle. For example, the Nerubian Eggs. Having this card in your deck along with the Nerubian Eggs and the new Shaman card, which we're going to talk about in a minute, is Reincarnate. You can have all this in your deck, and if you drop Baron Ribbon-Dare, and then you have a Nerubian Egg on the board, and then you use Reincarnate, which is quite a combo, let me tell you. It's certainly not something you can rely on, but if you do all this, then the Nerubian Egg dies, respawns, and then you get 2 of the 4/4 Nerubians instead. And that's kind of cool. I've actually seen it in action, but the problem is, of course, a Baron Rivendare is kind of one of those cards that you have to combine with other cards for it to be effective, and so that kind of decreases its overall effectiveness. The more you have to rely on combos in your deck, the less good your deck becomes. So it's important to remember this when putting cards like this into your deck. It sounds really cool, and it could be really cool and a lot of fun, and it'll definitely give you those crazy games that you never would have expected otherwise. But is it something that I would think of in a competitive level deck right now as things stand? Not necessarily, no. It's definitely, like I said, a fun card, but competitively and even for the ladder, I don't feel like it's reliable enough as things stand for it to be really useful, especially since it's a legendary. You can only have one of them in your deck. So what if it's on the bottom of your deck and you're relying on this card for a combo? You have everything else in your hand, but you never draw this. So now that combo is much less effective. So just some food for thought on this card. Moving on. The last neutral this week is the Spectral Knight. It's a 5-cost 4/6, and it can't be targeted by hero spells or hero powers. So it's basically a big fairy dragon. Fairy dragon, as you know or may not know, is a 2-cost 3/2, which has the same exact word. It can't be targeted by spells or hero powers. So I like this card because it's something that we kind of needed. We needed something more effective in the game. Something that couldn't be affected by Miracle Rogue and mages and just very easily removed. You know, usually you can just have even a control warrior will just easily remove any of your minions from the board, would just execute after doing 1 damage to them. This prevents that, which means they have to respond either with a weapon or with a minion of their own. So it kind of removes some of that solitaire aspect that people joke about in Hearthstone, where an entire turn goes by and like your opponent isn't really interacting with the board at all. It's just they're doing their own thing, and you're just sitting there like, well, what do I do now? You know, it's a one-sided game. So this kind of helps prevent those one-sided games where you just sit there and watch your opponent just ransack your board and deplete your health pool where you can't do anything. On the flip side, this means that you can't use spells on it to buff it or anything of the sort. You can't even heal it with your own hero power if you're a priest. So the decks that this can be run in is pretty limited. You can't put it in a priest deck, in my opinion. I wouldn't even put it in a paladin deck. This would be good in decks that are more mid-range, or even maybe a ramp druid, something that can really afford the mana cost of this card and is focused on getting those higher, more powerful minions on the board. Personally, I like the card. I think it's going to definitely be seeing a lot of use in the coming days and weeks. I don't think it's amazing or even a game changer, but it's definitely going to be a huge pain in the ass, and I'm very, very interested to see where this card goes. So that's it for the neutral cards for this week. Let's go ahead and hop into the class cards. Reincarnate, the card we just talked about. It's a 2-cost card for Shaman. Destroy a minion, then return it to life with full health. Reincarnate is kind of an interesting card, but at the same time, it doesn't really bring anything too new or overly exciting to the Shaman class. Shaman already has a card that kind of fulfills the same thing, except in a more passive manner. And this is Ancestral Spirit. Reincarnate will allow you to trigger this at will, while Ancestral Spirit is something that usually your opponent has to trigger, or you trigger by running the minion into something else. And of course, as the card description says, Reincarnate will destroy a minion and then return it to life with full health. And this also means that any death rattles go off when that minion dies. So you can use it on Sylvanas, you can use it on an Ancestral Spirit Earth Elemental if you so choose, and that would get you 3 Earth Elementals. So you can do kind of some crazy combinations with Reincarnate, but the problem with this card, and with Ancestral Spirit, and of course other cards in the Shaman class, is that they're reliant on combinations, and the more combinations you have in your deck, the weaker it ultimately becomes, because it relies on you drawing the right cards that you need in order to win the game. win conditions are something you have to keep in mind when building a deck. How do you win with this deck? And while Reincarnate adds a lot of fun and cool options, and I have no doubt in my mind that people will have a lot of fun with the card, it's kind of lacking quite a bit as far as the metagame goes and running it in ladder. If you're already one of those people that are in love with the Crusher Shaman variant, then you'll probably find a way to fit this card into that deck, and you'll have a lot of fun with it. But you're also going to have a lot of frustrating games where you just never draw into the things that you need, and you lose horribly. So that's a problem with this card. So I can't really get too excited about it. I like the concept of the card, but as a class card, it's one of the weakest that have been released so far, and it's just not something that I personally will ever really see myself using while playing competitively. And lastly, Voidcaller for the Warlock. The death rattle for this card: put a random demon from your hand into the battlefield, and it's a 4-cost 3/4, which isn't terrible. Now, this will put any card that's a demon from your hand onto the battlefield. So if you have Lord Jaraxxus in your hand, he'll come onto the battlefield as a 3/15, but his battle cry will not apply. So it's important to remember this. Demons that have battle cries will not have them applied when this card brings them onto the board. So assuming he's not silenced and he dies, you can get anything from a Flame Imp to a Lord Jaraxxus popping out of somebody's hand. So this is definitely something that I would consider silencing if I have a silence in my deck at the time. He's not something that you necessarily want to remove because you never know what you're going to get. What if they drop one of the more powerful demons onto the board afterwards? Now they have a 6/6, and they got it on there for free. They didn't have to spend any mana to get it. So this card could easily 2 or 3 for 1 you, just because of the fact that they're able to bring a more powerful demon onto the board, and it could pretty much wreck your day. Will we see demon synergy decks popping up and, Voidcaller seeing major usage? Again, I don't think so. I think this is a fun card, and it adds something that was missing previously for demons to help bypass those really negative battle cries that have a pretty large impact on Warlock, like destroying your mana crystal or taking away 5 of your health just for bringing out a minion. But all in all, demons are still pretty lacking, and I like Voidcaller. I think it's a step in the right direction, but I don't think we're really quite at the point where a demon deck is viable right now. So you're definitely going to see this guy in the ladder, so be prepared for him, but I don't think you're going to see him in large quantities yet. Perhaps when we get some more demon cards in the future that help kind of fix that demon synergy, we'll get to that point. But for now, just know that he's a good card, but not amazing. In fact, all the cards this week have been pretty good, but nothing has really been super game-changing or super crazy. So overall, while it's nice to get more cards into the game, think of them as just kind of a complement to what's already there at this point, rather than something new or amazing that's going to have a major impact on the meta, which I don't think Blizzard ever really intended from these cards anyway. They just kind of wanted to give you more options rather than drastically shaking things up. Anyway, that will do it for my card analysis of the military quarter for this week. Stay tuned next week as I take a look at the next quarter. Thanks for watching, and this is Striketh, checking out.